We're going to be in the book of Jonah, as we have been doing on Sunday nights and Wednesday nights. We've been doing a Bible class, and again, if you're new tuning into us, if you have my cell phone number and want to text me comments, you're welcome to do that. If you are watching and you're a friend of mine on Facebook and don't have my cell phone number, you can Facebook message me. My wife is monitoring that, and she can watch that. And by the way, there are 5 others in the building with me. If any of you want to make a comment, you're welcome to. You can certainly do that. It doesn't have to be by text message for those that are here in the building, but certainly welcome those. There's a lot of neat things in this little book. Jonah, yes, is a children's tale it's probably one of the earliest Bible stories we tell children. And for good reason. It's a really neat story. There's an amazing amount of things in it. But it's way, way deeper than that. There are some real amazing things here in this story. There are some things that will challenge us. He deals with a lot of issues that really are things we can identify with in our contemporary time. And so there are a lot of interesting things in this. Certainly when we slow down and we look at what the text says, that's my number one thing that I live by when it comes to Bible study. And if you are new to hearing me teach, I will tell you the biggest thing I've learned is you slow down and you read texts and you read them again and you look at what does it say. And if we do that with this book, I think some things will leap off the page at us that maybe we haven't seen before. And so that's why I want to take it a little slower. If I were normally going to do a sermon, I'd probably do all 4 chapters together. They are relatively short chapters, but I want to draw a few things out of them. One way of looking at Jonah, and I want to give you this is a freebie, but there are 4 chapters in Jonah, and you can, if you want to remember the book in 4 short sentences, this is the way you can remember it. In chapter 1, Jonah ran away from God. In chapter 2, Jonah is in the great fish, and Jonah runs back to God. In chapter 3 is when he preaches his sermon, and Jonah runs with God. And chapter 4, Jonah tries to go on and see God's people, or see the Ninevites punished, and Jonah runs ahead of God. And so if you can think of those 4, there's a lot more to it than that. But if you want just a skeleton outline to frame in your mind, chapter 1, he runs away from God. Chapter 2, he runs back to God. Chapter 3, he runs with God. And chapter 4, he runs ahead of God. And I don't remember where I got it. It's not original with me. That's probably one of those preachers' sermons or outlines that's been around so many times. Nobody knows who really wrote it in the beginning. But it is good. It's really good for remembering the flow of the book. But we're going to dive into it a little deeper than that. Chapter 1, verse 1. I want to tell you something that's interesting. This is what I want you to think about at the beginning. Other than Jonah's father, who isn't in the book, other than just being named in verse 1, every single person in the book of Jonah is a non-Israelite except for Jonah. There is a mistaken idea that a lot of people have that the Old Testament, that the Israelites were God's chosen people and only God's chosen people. They weren't the only people that God cared about. God cared about all the nations. Now, primarily, the focus is upon the Israelites because they were the ones descended from Abraham. But any and all nations that were willing to repent, turn to God, then God would take them. Any individuals that wanted to turn their heart to God or wanted to proselyte, become a part with the Jews, were allowed to do so. God accepted people to convert to him, and he was willing to do that. This book of Jonah is about saving a non-Israelite nation, the capital city of Assyria, which is Nineveh. And so this book challenges a lot of those same old thoughts we have, that God only ever reached out to the Israelites. God desired all men to repent, even in the Old Testament. And certainly that was the case. Okay, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Now we'll stop right there in the middle of the verse. God says to Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh. Nineveh and Assyria were to the northeast of where Jonah was. Jonah decides to go to Tarshish. Tarshish is due west. If you can picture in your mind, or if you have a picture in the back of your Bible, Tarshish is what we call Spain. Tarshish was as far away from them in the known world as they could possibly be. It is in the exact opposite of where Nineveh was, and as far away out there as it could possibly be. Tarshish is very rarely mentioned even in the Old Testament. It is a place that people would have known next to nothing about. Jonah undoubtedly would have never been there, and to think that he was going to go to Tarshish was as far away as you could possibly be. And so, there was a belief in the Old Testament times that God was a God of a nation, and that there was a God in this country, and you go over to another country, there'd be another God over there. And maybe mistakenly, Jonah had a little bit of that idea himself. That he thought, okay, God won't see me if I go over to Tarshish. If I go all the way over there, God won't know where I am, and I can hide from him. But it doesn't work out too well. We know that. And God is the God that created Tarshish along with Nineveh. And so he decides he's going to do that. Decides he's going to go off and go away from the presence of the Lord. In verse 3, the middle of verse 3, says, he went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Now, wherever he was in Israel at the time, he would have had to go downhill to go down to Joppa. Joppa was on the seashore. Joppa is famous in the New Testament. Remember where Joppa is famous in the New Testament? It is in Joppa that Peter is staying with Simon the tanner on the shore. And that's where it's mentioned in the New Testament. Anyway, you notice the progression. He goes down to the seashore, goes down to Joppa, and gets in a boat and goes down into the bottom. And you know what he's doing? He's heading away from God. Now I want to tell you, especially to our young people that might be listening, if you are headed away from God, there's only one way you're headed, and that's down. There is no up. There is no improvement to your life. Things don't get better if you're headed away from God. If you go away from God, you're going down. And everywhere he goes down. And the thing about going down, let me tell you the greatest secret about going down. If your life is headed down, you will go further down than you ever wanted to go or ever thought you would go. When people take up the first drink, they don't think about losing their family. getting a DUI, ending up in a gutter, or end up dying in their 50s because of liver damage. They don't think about that. People don't think about being hooked on drugs and losing everything they've got because they're hooked on drugs. You see, they may think about where they are, and they go down in the decision, and they're going to end up further down than they ever imagine they can go. You go into a situation where you are making poor choices with your marriage, or you find yourself in a questionable relationship that gets even worse until it becomes an adulterous relationship, or you get yourself in a mess that way or any other way. You get yourself in gambling. You get caught up in it. You don't lose your house on the first time you gamble, probably. But it happens over months, over years. And I will tell you, you head down, you are likely to go down further than you ever imagined. Does Jonah end up going down further? He goes way down by the time the story's over. He's headed down, headed away from God, and he has no clue how low he's going to get. And certainly his life shows that. If you're headed away from God, you're going down. And please, please learn that lesson. Learn the lesson from others that have done it. Do not go that way. If you're headed away from God, you're going down. Don't do that. See, that's a great lesson you find there. He does this to go away from the presence of the Lord, as it says in the end of verse 3. Verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. And there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give us a thought to us, that we may not perish." Jonah had gone down in the bottom of the ship. And why do you suppose Jonah went to sleep? Jesus was in the bottom of a ship asleep one time with his disciples in a storm, kind of like this. You remember that? Why was Jesus asleep? I'd say it's because his conscience was good. Jonah is asleep probably because his conscience is seared. He's put the matter to rest in his mind. He has given up. He is on his way to Tarshish, and he's not going to think another thing of it. You know, sometimes people sleep well because they're right with God. Some people, they sleep well because they're just so hard-hearted. They're just so far away that they don't worry about it anymore. That's a scary thing. It's a bothersome thing to me that Jonah was fast asleep in this ship. But he is. He's fast asleep in the bottom of the boat. Asleep enough that the captain decides, where is this guy? We put this guy on the boat. Where is he? And he goes down and finds him and he wakes him up and says, call on your God. Maybe he'll listen. They've already thrown all the cargo off of the ship. And now here they're grasping at straws, trying to find out what is going on. You know, we understand God was behind this storm because God is going to try to get Jonah's attention. That's what I love so much about God. Because you know what? There would have been other prophets in Israel. Do you think God could have gotten somebody else to go to Nineveh? If he had called another prophet, if he had sought another one, God could have said, okay, you go ahead and leave, and you'll die in Tarshish, or the ship will sink a mile off the shore at Tarshish. You see, God caused the storm, but he didn't cause the ship to sink. As much as God was upset, God is going to give Jonah a second chance. Does God need to give Jonah a second chance? I mean, God could find another prophet. God could find another way. But God is willing. God is willing and loving and caring enough to give Jonah a second chance. Aren't you glad God didn't judge you so harshly on your first mistake in life? You know, I'm glad we serve a God that gives second chances. Now, we can't count on second chances. Some people don't get a second chance. Uzzah only got to touch the Ark of the Covenant once, and he died. You know, Ananias and Sapphira, Nadab and Abihu only got to make a strange fire once. Ananias and Sapphira got to lie to the Holy Spirit once. I mean, so people get judged the first time, and so we cannot be cavalier about that. But generally speaking, we serve a God that gives second chances. And we can be so grateful that he does. And so God puts this storm. And the mariners, the sailors are afraid. And they've thrown the cargo. And they're all crying out to their gods, just hoping one of them hears. The captain of the ship goes and gets Jonah and wakes him and says, call on your God so that we might not perish. Verse 7, and they said to one another, come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. You know, that's very interesting. You know, when you look at this, Jonah had already told them. Apparently when he got on the boat, they probably took one look at him and thought, what do you want to go to Tarshish for? They probably asked the question when he bought the ticket. You know, he clearly wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't a man that had a bunch of goods that he was trying to take to Tarshish. He wasn't doing that. He was just simply going to Tarshish. It was not a travel destination. People didn't go there to lay on the beach in those days. He was already at a beach when he was doing that. So, I mean, it was ridiculous to think that he would have good reason to go to Tarshish. And so they probably asked him point blank, why are you going? And he had to tell them something. He says, I'm trying to get away from the Lord. And so they cast lots, find out he's the one. They ask him who he is. He says, I'm Hebrew, and I fear the Lord. Now, he might be giving himself a little bit of credit that he doesn't deserve, because if he really feared the Lord, would he be on a boat going to Tarshish? He's got a crisis of faith, doesn't he? You know, if he really was fearing the Lord, he'd be on his way to Nineveh right now. and not in this boat? Well, maybe this event has stirred up a little bit more fear for the Lord than he had. He says about the Lord, he says, he's the God of heaven. And he's the one that made the sea and the dry land. Well, when they heard that, he's the one that made the sea, and here they are in the water. Now they're afraid. If they weren't afraid before, now they're afraid to hear that. And so they say, what have you done to us? What is this you've done? And they said the men already knew he was fleeing for the presence of the Lord because he told them that. I got a comment from Rodney. He said that he knew the good that was in Jonah's heart. And I believe that God certainly did know, but Jonah's heart was troubled, or he wouldn't be in that boat. He was dead set of going away. Now God, of course, knew the rest of the story with Jonah. I get that. But Jonah was really in a crisis of his faith, a crisis of his belief, his obedience, and he was heading away from God. Yes, Ethan?
You just talked about belief in God. I wondered, did it make the other people that were praying to their gods believe in the one true God?
Oh, yeah. Just read the next few verses here. For sure, it does. It makes, Ethan brings out, and so that you can hear, he says, does this make the people that were praying to their gods believe in the one true God as the result of this? And yes, you look at this text, there is great influence brought upon them because of this. I'm going to take a sip of water here, and we'll get to hear the next few verses. He says in verse 11, what shall we do that the sea might quiet down for us? The sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, this is Jonah speaking to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Now, this may speak to what Rodney was mentioning, that Jonah says, throw me into the sea. Jonah probably thought that he was going to be done. He probably thought that his life would be lost. You'd have to think in the middle of a storm like that, and you have to also think you couldn't swim to shore, being too far out to sea, and that you would certainly be lost very soon. And he had to think that he was deserving of what would come to him, deserving of what bad or ill would fall upon him. And so he tells them, so that you can save yourselves, throw me into the sea. And that is a noble action in a way that Jonah is trying to do, or at least it seems like a noble action. And so, verse 13, nevertheless the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, and they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. They did not want to do what Jonah said. They tried very hard to keep that from happening. To their credit, they tried to row. They heard what he said, but they weren't about to do it. And that says something about them, that these apparently were good men. Verse 14, this is what Ethan was kind of saying. Therefore, they called out to the Lord. You see, they had their own gods that they were calling out to, and now they hear about what Jonah has said, and that Jonah said, my God is the one that created the sea and the dry land, and so I'm the God, it's the God of the Hebrews. And so now they're calling out to the Lord, oh Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So, Lord, forgive us for what we're going to do. We're going to throw this man into the sea as he has asked. But please don't hold this against us. And you have done what you chosen to do. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So here, these men who had random gods that they worshipped now have become convinced that the Lord is God. You see, we don't know the nationalities of these men, but they're clearly not Hebrews, or else they would have known that Jonah was. Because they would have known the language, they would have recognized the dialect, they would have recognized his facial features and plenty of other things. They would have known pretty quickly had they been Hebrews themselves. And so they are mariners from whatever other country, and they have their gods that they follow and that they worship. And so here now, they have prayed to and they sought the help of the Lord. And now they make a sacrifice to the Lord and they make vows to the Lord. These men, and maybe, making good things out of bad things that come, this is a way that these men were brought to the Lord. Could very well be. Now, that's not justifying Jonah's actions for what he did. Jonah was wrong, but that might be the silver lining to what takes place here, is that these men have now turned over to serve the Lord. They've made sacrifices to God. They have worshiped God. They've made vows to God. And maybe now they have become servants of God as well. Now, the last verse of the chapter says, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Now, something we did not discuss in the beginning. Why do you suppose Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh? Why do you suppose he didn't want to go preach? You know, if you're a prophet and a preacher, and there's a pulpit with a lot of people that want to hear, you want to go? So why would he be reluctant? Why would he be against that? Why would he want to run away? Yeah, they were the enemies. They were the Assyrians, and the Assyrians were in about 100 years going to destroy the northern kingdom, and so this is taking place about 100 some years before Isaiah, where we looked at this morning. That they were going to be the ones to destroy the northern kingdom, and they were a rising, very evil power, and so they were the arch enemies of the Israelites. And so they're bad characters. And so
was he fully scared of the enemy, or was he fully scared of God?
Okay, you bring up a good question. Was he scared of the enemy, or was he scared of God? And I would say it's something along these lines. Kind of in the middle of what you guys are saying. I think it was, in a lot of ways, just plain old bigotry. He was against the people that were going to be the enemies of his nation. He was against this nation that was going to harm his. They were his enemies. And so when he heard that God was going to punish them, he was like, yeah, at least that's what I kind of picture. Because anybody in that day and time would have wanted Assyria to get theirs. God punishing Assyria, the Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria, would have been a good thing in Israel. You know, he probably thought, what am I going to do when I get back home? What is he going to say to the neighbors? You know, it goes something like this, I suppose. The neighbors say, where you been, Jonah? You've been gone a while. Mission trip. Where'd you go? Nineveh. Where'd you say? In Nineveh. What'd you go there for? Well, God was going to destroy him, but I intervened. And they're good now. You did what? I mean, that's the way he would have been reacted. And I realize that's probably a little bit of a melodramatic rendering of that, but they hated the Assyrians. They were afraid of the Assyrians. And so if he were going in there to intervene, that would not have been a popular move when he got back home, to be quite blunt about it. And so there is prejudice. There is bigotry in this. And so he is against them because they are the arch enemy. And they, if they're going to receive this punishment, then that'd be a good thing for most Israelites to see. And so he doesn't want to restore Nineveh because he doesn't want Nineveh restored. He wants them judged by God. Now, that's a pretty self-righteous attitude to have, isn't it? And so sometimes we can be guilty of that kind of thing. We want our sins to be forgiven, but we look at other people and say, well, you're not going to forgive them, and you need to judge them. You need to send down fire upon them, or this or that. And, we serve a God of second chances. Jonah's going to get a second chance, and Nineveh's going to get a second chance. And so God is going to show his grace and his mercy and his forgiveness by giving Nineveh the opportunity to be forgiven. And so, even though Jonah is struggling with, does he want to go there? He doesn't. He wants to get away. He does say that he fears the Lord, but I think he's afraid of helping the Ninevites more than he is of fearing the Lord. And that's why he goes and does what he does. So the first chapter he goes down, and he goes down further than he thought, and that's what we're going to see in chapter 2. The Lord appointed a great fish. Now, what kind of fish was it that God appointed? And quite bluntly, we don't know. We really don't. Some texts, the King James will say a whale, or some of them will say whale. Some of them say great fish. The reason is because the Hebrew word there is a little bit ambiguous as to which it is. It probably even could be translated sea monster, but that probably wouldn't be that politically correct for many to imagine. God appointed it. God maybe even created it. He created everything. This could have been a one-of-a-kind fish that God brought to this. It's also very interesting. The Mediterranean, where he is, has, until recent years, when they've been overfished or whatever, some of the largest great whites on the planet are in the Mediterranean. Could have been a great white shark. If he got past the teeth, he would have been okay. But, you're shaking in your boots over there, aren't you, Ethan? Thinking about that. But yeah, some of the biggest great whites on the planet are in the Mediterranean. And so, what's that? Sharks and spiders are your things? Okay. So you need to make sure and tell when you go to get married that you need to make sure she knows that she's got all the spiders to take care of. She already knows that? Our son's the same way. But don't tell him I told the whole world. But yeah, he's the same way. Anyway. Yeah. But, we don't know what kind of fish it was. I think God appointed it, whatever it was, and it may have been a special one-of-a-kind fish. Anyway, chapter 2, we're going to read this a few minutes. Chapter 2, we'll read the whole chapter. Look at the description. There's not much to say about it, but look at Jonah's description. It's basically a prayer and a poem that he writes about his time in the belly of the fish. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me out of the belly of Sheol. Sheol's the grave. I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head and the roots of the mountain. I went down to the land whose bars crossed upon me forever. Yet you brought up life from your pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon dry lands. I like Jonah's description of the seaweed being wrapped around his head and the waters of the deep surrounding him. And what an amazing thing that was. And the end of that is he realizes that salvation belongs to the Lord. And so what an amazing thing it was that he went through that. And you know what? He gets spit out onto the dry land. And then you got to realize that he's got several days to walk. He's got 3 days to walk to get to where he has to go. So he's got to still walk. And you know what? When he gets spit out on the dry land, he's probably not any closer or as close to Nineveh as he was when he started out. He'd gone all that way to end up on the seashore of the Mediterranean. And so went all that way just to end up where he started out. But oh, what a rough ride. Between the ship and the 3 days in the fish. You ever take a route like that? You think you're going from A to B, but the way that you act and what you do gets you in a mess, and you have to go all the way around just to get back to where he started. And certainly Jonah did that. Jonah comes back to God, and, you know, there's no atheist in the belly of a fish. There's nobody prideful or arrogant in the belly of a fish. The only thing to do is get humble. The only thing to do is get right with the Lord. And so that's what he does in chapter 2. And so you got to love this story, that there's so much there. And yet here he is. He's on his way back. And, you know, you'll see the next couple chapters. We'll look at those Wednesday night. I encourage you to read those and look at those. And so if there's not any other questions or comments, we'll go ahead. As always, we make it available for anybody to come to the Lord, and we want you to do that. Please reach out to us any way you know how, by text, email, phone call, whatever. Please be in touch with us, and we'll be in touch with you to study with you. I'd be glad to do that. Be glad to help you in any way to become a child of God. So that's all I have for this evening. I appreciate our time together and look forward to Wednesday night when we can finish up the book of Jonah. So we'll now be led by one more song by Tim, and then Ethan Wilson, who's come and joined us this evening. He's going to lead us in our closing prayer after that. Thank you.